Hello and good morning, everyone. I can see more and more people joining us, so that's my cue to begin. Welcome to the panel on demystifying the women, peace and security agenda and its linkage with climate change, which is a part of OCIC's International Development Week 2023. My name is Pragya Tikku, and I'm the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist at OCIC. A few instructions before we begin to aid our experience today. Please note that closed captioning is available and can be accessed by clicking on the Show Captions option in Zoom. You're able to move the transcript box around your screen as well. Throughout the event, feel free to ask questions for the speakers. You can also do so by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We also like to invite you to join the conversation on social media using hashtag IDW2023 and hashtag GoForTheGoals, and to tag OCIC on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. OCIC is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space. We ask all of you to commit to our code of conduct inspired by those of the Intercouncil Network and Amnesty Canada. This code of conduct, which Arabelle is sharing in the chat right now, outlines our shared commitments towards respect, inclusion, humility, safety, solidarity, patience, and openness for all participants and collaborators. If you experience anything or see anything which is in conflict with the code of conduct, please do not engage directly. Contact an organizer and we will respond appropriately. Before I get into today's agenda, I would like to begin by sharing that OCIC recognizes and honors the Indigenous peoples who have historically and do presently live and work on the traditional, both treaty and unceded territories that we operate on. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, and many others. We acknowledge that our board, staff, volunteers, members, and broader community operate on the treaty and unceded territories of these and numerous other Indigenous peoples and nations. As we reflect on our role within a settler colonial context, we acknowledge the importance of naming the Indigenous peoples and nations on whose land we live, work, and play, and understand the importance of framing our engagement in the international cooperation sector and beyond through the lens of reconciliation and decolonization. We recognize that we have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who have and continue to fight for social justice on their own lands. I am now honored to welcome and introduce Canada's Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Jacqueline O'Neill. Jacqueline O'Neill is Canada's first ambassador for women, peace, and security. Appointed by the Prime Minister in June 2019, her primary role is to advise ministers of foreign affairs, defense, and numerous other departments engaged in implementing Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. Previously, Ambassador O'Neill was the president of the Institute for Inclusive Security, a US-based organization that increased the inclusion of women in peace negotiations and related processes, including the reform of police and military organization. Over 13 years at Inclusive Security, she supported the creation of national strategies and policy frameworks for more than 30 countries, the NATO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the United Nations. She also worked directly with coalitions of women leaders in Colombia, South Sudan, Pakistan, and beyond. Prior to that, Ambassador O'Neill worked at the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in Sudan. Along with former Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, she helped found the Romeo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative to eliminate the use of children during conflict. She was also the policy advisor to Canada's Secretary of State for the Asia-Pacific region. Most recently, Ambassador O'Neill was a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Canada Institute, professor at Georgetown University, and a member of Board of Directors of the Canadian International Council. She has a bachelor's degree in commerce from the University of Alberta and a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. It is my absolute pleasure to now hand it over to the ambassador for her opening remarks.
There we go. You'd think it was my first ever Zoom. You'd think it was my first Zoom meeting in forever. Can you all hear me now? Okay. Yes, great. Okay. Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction, Pragya, and thanks to the OCIC for having this meeting and convening us today. And I know everyone is very eager to get to the panel discussion, so I'll get right to it. I want to really, though, acknowledge colleagues from Global Affairs Canada, Siham, who's here and who will be moderating the panel. And then, of course, to our panelists, Dr. Oates. I think, Lauren, you and I are averaging right now about one online meeting a week, it seems. And then Dr. Perveen, who I'm really, really eager to hear more. I've been reading your work online for a little while, so very eager to hear more of that. And to all of you who are joining. Pragya, thank you so much for doing a really meaningful acknowledgement of the land that so many of us are joining from. I want to add too that I'm sure, like many of you, I've been able to participate in a fair number of events and discussions during this Black History Month, and really paying extra attention to make sure that we dig in and try to understand both the immense contributions that our Black colleagues make and have made to the various fields in which we work. And then, of course, the many barriers that they continue to face in the way that all of the roles that we have in dismantling those barriers individually and systemically. Alors, donc, je tiens vraiment à vous remercier pour toute cette opportunité d'être ici, de pouvoir participer dans cette discussion importante et opportune en plus. C'est vrai que le lien entre les femmes, la paix et la sécurité et le changement climatique est clair, c'est essentiel de l'aborder. Et j'apprécie beaucoup comment le titre de cette session a été formulé. So you talked about demystifying women, peace, and security and its linkages to climate change. I did a session at NATO headquarters a month or two or a few months ago, specifically on this topic. And in preparing for it, I asked my counterpart in NATO, the ambassador or the special envoy for women, peace, and security. I said, what would be useful for people to hear? Just tell me what you think would be important. And she said, everybody always gets the line, women and girls are disproportionately affected by insert whatever topic of issue. So by war, by violence, by conflict-related sexual violence, by migration, by cyber, et cetera. And she said, we almost never actually really unpack that. So what are those disproportionate impacts? Why do they exist, et cetera? So how? And so that's what I'd love to do today is share a little bit about my perspective on the how, the connections and the ways and the reasons why climate change itself is disproportionately impacting women. To share a little bit about some of the ways that relates to security, so the S in women, WPS, Women, Peace, and Security, and then to tell you a little bit about some of the ways that within the government of Canada, we're trying to coordinate our thinking about that, and of course, our action on that. So, and apologies if some of this is, I'll say each of you know aspects of this far better than I do. And so I'm not trying to explain, especially the development related aspects of this to anyone. I just want to lay out as we see them, these really deep connections. So, climate change obviously disproportionately impacts women and girls, and especially those within women and girls groupings who are marginalized or particularly vulnerable, including Indigenous women. So a lot of that is linked to the control that many women have over decisions that are governing their lives, like where their families live, how family income is spent, et cetera, leaving many of them more likely to be exposed to disaster-induced risks and of losses. So less control and agency means they have a decreased ability to adapt to changes in climatic conditions. And even when they have extensive knowledge and experience of what needs to be done to adapt, they're often less able to absorb climate shocks. So women and girls have higher levels of mortality, morbidity in situations of disaster. In part, that's for I won't say simple, but really direct reason that women are more likely than men to be poor. Racialized women, Indigenous women are more likely than white women to be poor. They're more likely to live in inadequate housing in urban and rural areas of low land value. They're much more vulnerable to climate-related events like floods, storms, avalanches, earthquakes, etc. And they also have often very limited wealth or autonomy to proactively, and willingly flee high-risk areas. Of course, we also know that when there is forced migration, it increases the risk of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. It disrupts justice systems, education, sexual and reproductive health services and access to them. There's inequitable access to disaster relief and aid and recovery funding. And of course, we know that these issues compound. So we see, for example, girls are kept home from school because they need more and more time to gather fuel or to walk to get water or firewood. So that perpetuates another cycle of girls and women being left out of education. Or when families with farmlands are affected, we see increases of child marriage because there are increased burdens and inabilities to feed all of the children in a home. So families are more likely to have a daughter, for example, be married at a young age. So we know that, gender-based violence itself also spikes during disaster and conflict. I often cite to colleagues that in series of discussions, and this was something that a study I saw recently, when women around the world are asked about their security concerns, they consistently rank climate change as either number one or as among the top. Now, as many of you know, they often don't call it climate change, they call it the weather or the environment or conditions that physical conditions that they're living in. But it's really consistent that women for decades, obviously this is not new, have been talking about climate change as a security threat. So while we simultaneously know that women are overrepresented in impacts, they're also underrepresented in decision-making or the development of adaptation strategies. And I think sometimes this policymakers tend to focus on these disproportionate impacts, and it obscures women's leadership qualities. They're discounting their unique skills, their perspectives, what women have to bring in addressing the issues of climate change, of security, and resource management. And we just see that women around the world, particularly Indigenous women, are really actively engaged in advocacy to protect land, to protect water and air from degradation and contamination. And yet we don't often recognize or meaningfully include them in decision-making aspects. And then that includes, and I'll emphasize too, really women being subjected to harassment and to online and cyber violence, which is a really increasing form of violence that women are facing, often facing really hypersexualized attacks on their reputation, their families, et cetera, and women really being particularly vulnerable to online and digital forms of abuse, in part because of their environmental activism. So that's some of the many ways that women in particular are disproportionately affected. So how does this relate to security? So people and countries that are most vulnerable to climate change also tend to be most vulnerable to armed conflict, to violence, to terrorist recruitment. So for example, of the 15 most exposed countries to the impacts of climate change, 8 of them right now host UN peacekeeping or special political missions. We see adversaries of peace constantly seizing opportunities that are created for disruption by this climate crisis and by gender equality. So what do we mean by that? We see increases in recruiting bases for terrorist groups and armed factions. They see that families are having to keep kids out of school, that girls are walking longer distances, families having to move, to relocate. They're seeing these opportunities and they're recruiting increasingly. We're seeing things, ISIS, for example, exploiting water shortages to provide different resources and impose their will on communities. We're seeing all kinds of ways that violent extremist groups, that authoritarian governments and others are exploiting these vulnerabilities that are created in order to also exploit the fact that there are significant gender differences or gender inequality. So just to highlight or to close on this final point a little bit about what Canada is doing, or the government of Canada, and how we're thinking about addressing these intersections. I'll say that one of the, there are a whole range of ways, and I'm happy to say that there's far more going on than I could list or name in this short session, but a space that I'm most directly engaged in relates to Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And I hope many of you know that we have one now. We have a second iteration of our plan, and we're in the process of drafting our third. It's a cross-government strategy. And this third one will have at least 10 government departments or partners, so partners and agencies. And we all make commitments about how we're going to advance women's inclusion, women's leadership, women's protection, and a broad range of peace and security issues. And of course, climate change and climate affects the work of all of the departments across our government. So from the start of the drafting process for this new plan, we've been really intentional in naming climate change as an aspect that is deeply related to women, peace, and security, and making sure that each of the departments and agencies that are partners specify steps that they're taking to address this or to engage with this in different ways. So just to name a few of the connections. So Global Affairs Canada, all things international security related. So all intersections between climate and security relate to Global Affairs Canada. We're pulling together a whole range of that work. I think some of you would have seen, or I hope all of you saw that our Minister of International Development announced a couple of weeks ago, I think $315 million in funding for organizations in Canada to engage in climate action activities. And that includes at least 20 million earmarked for women's rights and climate change adaptation, and 15 million for supporting Indigenous people and organizations in Canada. So fortunately, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs and Indigenous Services Canada are also partners of this plan. They're certainly making linkages and enhancing our shared understanding of Indigenous women's roles as keepers of water, of climate and other forms of natural resources, and not just understanding and appreciating current and historical leadership roles of Indigenous women in those spaces, but also ensuring to the best that we can as a government, increasing their roles as decision makers as it relates to that. Another big aspect of that is we have so much to learn from Indigenous communities in Canada about keeping our resources and respecting the environment and managing resources responsibly. So we see at Global Affairs some of our role in sharing back some of those lessons and experiences internationally. Of course, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, so another department, huge impacts of climate change, climate emergencies on migration. Obviously, huge impacts for women within that, and that's a number of their commitments name that. We have a Department of Public Safety dealing with all sorts of disaster preparedness and climate emergencies and trying to understand how many of those affect women and girls, men, women, people of different genders differently. The Department of National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces, when I was preparing actually for the NATO speech, I came across a stat that was I found amazing about the extent to which climate is affecting the Canadian Armed Forces and the decisions that they're making. So in between 1990 and 2010, the Canadian Armed Forces had 6 deployments within Canada focused on responses to climate emergencies. So in a 20-year period, they had 6 deployments. In the 9-year period that follows, they had 30. So they went from 6 deployments in 20 years to 30 deployments in 9 years. So we're seeing the Canadian Armed Forces, again, having massive resource implications, operational implications, personnel implications, responding to climate emergencies. And of course, we have to make sure that they are seeing, understanding, building into their operations, awareness about how climate emergencies affect women differently and uniquely, and that they're engaged in making decisions and in planning, et cetera. The last thing I note on that, maybe 2 last things before I wrap up. We're also engaged, we're trying to ensure that attention to women, peace, and security is integrated in the various ways that we're thinking about climate and security. So for example, Canada is leading in the creation of what's called the NATO Center of Excellence. This one is on climate change and security. And we've been really intent from the beginning on ensuring that we have as much as possible determination to ensure that women and girls' unique experiences and needs, those of Indigenous peoples and others, are really integrated and assessed from the beginning and addressed from the beginning, so that we're not sort of just waiting until the mandate is formed, that the terms of reference are created, and then we say, and also women, and really determined to do that. And the last thing that I'd highlight is that we're also really, really determined to learn from other parts of the world that have been engaging with these issues in different ways, and for in many instances much longer than we have. So I was in Rakshinda, your neighborhood. I was in Bangladesh a couple of months ago, or several months ago, and as you know, they've been dealing with climate emergencies and climate-induced disasters for many, many years, and have in many cases introduced really important practices for integrating, for example, women as community alerts or early warning signals, especially women at community levels. I mean, there's just an enormous amount that we in Canada can learn, especially as it relates to climate disaster and response from countries around the world. And I think we have to be exceptionally deliberate in seeking out those lessons. So Bangladesh was a great experience for doing that, and to understanding the many ways that Canada has much to learn on both the impacts, but also strategies for really engaging women in designing solutions. So I've talked a lot. I feel like I'm just monologuing into some boxes on the internet, and I really do want to stop here and turn to colleagues for much more of the panel discussion and to hear what all of our colleagues have to say. And again, I really want to thank you for including me in this conversation and for making these linkages, because they're just exceptional. And as we talked about, women from around the world have been making them for decades. And this is yet another example of where we need to listen to women on front lines of a range of issues that we need to then address at a very systemic level. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your remarks and for outlining women, peace and security and its linkage with climate change, development, humanitarian action, and along with an insight into what the Canadian government is doing in this regard. So this is a very useful context now that we transition into our panel portion, where we will hear from experienced international cooperation actors on their projects and impacts in their local and global communities. For that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the event, Dr. Siham Rayale. Dr. Rayale's research and advocacy has focused on issues relating to women, peace and security, and women's political participation in conflict and post-conflict context. Siham has extensive experience working in complex humanitarian environments and leading research that promotes women's inclusion in peace processes. She's currently a senior policy analyst at Global Affairs Canada and a lecturer at University of Toronto in the Women and Gender Studies Department. She has a master's in development from York University and an LLM from Osgoode Hall Law School at York University and a PhD from SOAS University of London. Over to you, Siham.
Thank you, Pragya, for that kind and generous introduction. And thank you to the OCIC for convening us in order to have this really, really important conversation today. You'll be hearing from our esteemed panelists, and they will be providing remarks and a presentation. And I do hope after that we can have participants engaging actively in a Q&A. So there is a Q&A function to the webinar. Please feel free to use it so we can ensure that your questions are read and our panelists are engaged. And thank you to the ambassador for offering her remarks and certainly outlining how critically important this issue is. And it's not underestimating just how big the problem is. In the last decade, we've seen the rise of climate-related disasters become worse and worse, particularly for the most vulnerable. And there are growing calls for climate action amid rising global insecurity in many parts of the world. Our dialogue today, and indeed from what you'll hear from the panelists, is about emphasizing what that climate action cannot be divorced from women's experiences of conflict and peace building. This new agenda, the intersection between climate, conflict, and crisis, is to say that gender dimensions are indispensable when considering the impacts of climate change, particularly in countries experiencing humanitarian disasters or with ongoing and protracted conflicts. Now, climate vulnerability, as the ambassador said, exacerbates existing power dynamics and norms and practices that inhibit progress toward gender equality. The majority of the world's subsistence farmers are women. The majority of IDPs and refugees are women, and the majority of grassroots peace builders and civil society leaders are women, but they're also among the most vulnerable to climate-related shocks stemming from and enabled by conflict and crisis. In 2022, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls described climate change as, quote, the most consequential threat multiplier for women and girls, with far-reaching impacts on new and existing forms of gender inequities. Now, as we, I hope in this conversation, demystify the linkages between women, peace, and security and climate advocacy, there's a need for immediate action to ensure their voices are front and center. And we will be asking our panelists at the end of our conversation how we can all get involved. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists with us today. We have Dr. Lauren Oates, who is the Executive Director of Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, where she also contributes to the planning and design of the organization's education programming in Afghanistan in the areas of teacher education, literacy education, and technology for education. Now, CW4W Afghan created Afghanistan's first and only open educational resource initiative, the Dar-e-Danesh Library, winner of a presidential citation from the American Library Association, and developed a successful adult literacy education program known as Afghanistan Loa Li, Afghanistan Reads, recognized as a literacy best practice honoree by the United States Library of Congress. Lauren has designed national strategies to promote children's reading for governments in the Global South and has led numerous evaluations, verifications, and gender analyses for USAID-funded education projects in Afghanistan. Her doctoral research with the Language and Literacy Education Department at the University of British Columbia focused on the development of mother tongue teaching resources using ICT for primary teachers in northern Uganda. She is currently adjunct faculty at the Faculty of Education at UBC and has taught graduate studies at the School of Humanitarian Studies at Royal Roads University in Victoria since 2014. Dr. Rakshinda Praveen is a thoughtpreneur, author, activist, medical doctor, and gender equality expert. She is an intersectional feminist who introduced social entrepreneurism to Pakistan and a single parent who transitioned from a career in medicine into public health and journalism. She had the honor of creating the award-winning series Gender Watch on gender issues on PTV, Pakistan television, between 1999 and 2001, that not only pioneered generating a public discourse on gender issues with youth perspectives, but also instituted the Urdu alternative of gender, Sindh, in Pakistan. From 2002 to 2003, she was a gender advisor to South Asia for the Canadian government and led 5-country gender equality programs in Pakistan. She founded the first co-working space, Kafkam, and founded the first ever chamber of women social entrepreneurs dedicated to the struggles of disabled, divorced, abandoned wives, and trans women. As an op-ed writer, she has covered a variety of subjects, including gender, power, patriarchy, class, social justice, inequalities, and climate issues. When I say these are esteemed panelists, I meant it. To get us started, I'd like to invite our panelists to talk about the context of their work and the connections they have witnessed between the Women, Peace and Security agenda and climate change. Rakshinda, could you introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Thank you, Siham, and thank you to OCIC. After this generous introduction, nothing much is left for me, but you can see this is not a PowerPoint presentation, but a montage. I just wanted to share my people, South Asian people, and with a more focus on unequal people and some of my work, some of my parts of my journey as a media practitioner, as a development practitioner as well. And from Environment Ministry to Ministry of Climate Change, it has been a long interval, but what has changed so far? So before talking about it, a little bit about myself, that I'm a perpetual student of life and I'm a global citizen. And being an intersectional feminist, all these, parts, peace, security, climate, gender equality, rather inequality issues, they're interlinked and interlocked. So I am quite excited to be a part of this prestigious forum. A lot of participants are there, esteemed panelists are here, and after listening to the ambassador, I was just thinking it, how similar are we in many respects, but I would try to highlight some of the unique features of South Asia, and with a special focus on Pakistan, of course, because I belong to Pakistan, technically and legally. But more of my work is about people who are living below poverty line and who are poor, not in terms of income poverty, but also poverty of opportunities they're experiencing. And this is not only about gender-based violence, but it is also about what happens in disaster, what happens in humanitarian setting, and what is the politics of gender in South Asian countries, which are very vulnerable in terms of climate change impact as well. So I try to learn and address some of the intersecting inequalities in my different areas of work. And to conclude here for a while, I would say that my work in Pakistan and in South Asia has been diverse, but the common denominator has remained equality and empowerment, uh, primarily for women with overlapping vulnerabilities. And I think we will be able to unpack that what are these vulnerabilities and why particular set of disadvantages make us a bit different, if not difficult, from rest of the world or from the north. So thank you, Dr. Siham, for introducing me and asking me about my work. Thank you.
No, thank you for being with us. I'm going to come back to that term you used, poverty of opportunities. Dr. Oates, if I could invite you to introduce yourself and your work.
Yeah, I have one of those jobs that's really hard to describe in one word. I'm not like police or professor or veterinarian, such that my kindergartner thinks that I don't have a job at all. It's just so muddled to describe. Maybe I should just say I'm a professional feminist, sort of drawing some inspiration from Dr. Praveen's introduction. But day to day, what I do is advocate for education for everyone equitably. So for women and girls everywhere, and both in terms of access to education, but also to the kind of education people get, to the content of education. And that's actually also part of the definition of the human right to education, as it's described in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Convention on Children's Rights. Though sometimes the content part gets left out when we talk about the right to education and we focus more on access. But it's so important that it's not only about being in a classroom, but what kind of education you're able to access, and that you're able to access a relevant quality education that helps you realize the goals you have for your life. So I advocate for that, and I'm a practitioner as well, as you heard, involved in planning and delivering programs in education that try to meet those twin goals of the right to education, access, and quality. I'm not a climate expert by any means at all, but one of the links that I'll try to make in my remarks later on is how relevant the education of women and girls is to fighting climate change, because the people affected by climate change must be empowered to speak out about how it's affecting them and to inform and indeed lead solutions. And education is critical to that. It's absolutely an essential component. And I'm sure anyone who's ever completed a proposal for Global Affairs Canada, the long proposals, there's always that section on environment and how your project, what kind of impact your project may have on the environment. In our organization at Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, we tend not to construct physical structures. Our work is more about constructing knowledge and ensuring access to information and paving the road to peace through learning and teaching. So, we don't answer that question in talking about the impact that, what we're building will have on education. The way we answer that question always comes down to education and how education programming can extend environmental and climate education, and how important it is for people to have access to information, but also to speak. It's a two-way street to being able to be part of the dialogue on climate change. And the last thing I'll say, I just want to sort of go back in time a bit to work I did actually a decade ago now, unbelievably, with UNICEF, where I was working on one of the multiple indicator cluster surveys that UNICEF does in countries, typically every 3 to 5 years, where they try to measure progress on, at that time, what was still the Millennium Development Goals before the SDGs, and specifically looking at the situation of women and children. So the data collected was about human development indicators across a range of areas, in education, in child protection, in wealth and inequality, healthcare. Overall, there were actually 81 different indicators measured, and this was a massive survey. I think there was 21,000 participants in the survey, representing every one of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. And so I got this pile of data, and my job was to sit down and sift through it and try to see what it said, try to find the patterns, and what we could learn from those. And every person who was included in the survey, background characteristics were collected about them: their education level, where they lived, did they live in a rural area or an urban area, what was the wealth level of their household, work, and a range of other background characteristics. And pretty quickly, I saw this pattern that literally every single one of those 81 indicators had a, what we said was a correlation, but I think it's actually a causal relationship with the educational level of the mother specifically. And it turned out that you could predict everything through that. The educational level of the mother, as it rose, would predict how likely the children were to survive infancy and childhood, how likely they were to be in school, how likely they were to not be involved in child labor, to not be exposed to violence. And it went beyond the children and the mother herself. It went to the wealth of the household, and all kinds of other indicators. It was just remarkable. And I think you see that story play out in contexts, all over the world, well beyond Afghanistan. And so it's a link that we cannot ignore, and really has to be central to policy. So lots more to say, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Dr. Oates. And then I was making notes while you were talking and considering the linkages between climate change and the WPS agenda and just crises in general. I was struck by the intergenerational work that you do, right? And its impact on future generations, and certainly the intergenerational impact that climate change has on all of our lives, right? So I'm going to come back to that because we'd love to hear more of it. Rakshinda, if I can start the conversation with you. Could you tell us more about the gendered impact of climate change in South Asia, and particularly in Pakistan as your focus area, and how, but also certainly the impacts of climate change and how they connect and to the women, peace and security agenda, but how women in Pakistan are organizing for change.
Okay. Now there are, well, I'm not a number person, but there are 5 key words: Pakistan, South Asia, climate, gender. And since the focus is a little bit more on Pakistan, so I cannot ignore recent floods in Pakistan as a consequence of climate impact. Now, gender, as Ambassador said, it's very difficult, I think, to talk with and among informed audience. So I'm not going into academic details or starting quoting stats, but it is important to recall some of the numbers, statistics, gender inequality measures, and human development indicators in the area that include health, education, political participation, economy, and we have alarming ranks on these indicators. Then South Asia, as we said earlier, it is vulnerable to climate change impact. But the irony, I will point out towards the irony, is that when we say that, okay, women are oppressed and they are more unequal, and in the same region, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, we had women leaders, women prime ministers, presidents. So we have to actually, there's a need to unpack women. So we are talking about more unequal women. We are talking about marginalized women. As you said that you will come back to me with this poverty of opportunity. So don't look at the women who are in leadership roles. I know they are less and they are brilliant women, but you cannot detach when we talk about gender inequalities, the conflict of class. And it's not necessary that all women who are there in leadership roles, they are less patriarchal, because patriarchy is an ideology and not a biological trait, and it's not limited to men only. Now, now comes climate. Now, climate has always been very close to the heart, skill set, and knowledge of women, where the rest of the world knew it or not. And so is the case with South Asian women, where basically primary economy is based on agriculture. So they are, when we say, oh, they are disproportionately affected, and what is the disproportionate effect? What is the dimension? And apart from, that, okay, they have to be the one who works in the field and who cooks the food and who collect the fuel. So I'm not going to repeat what we know already, what we have heard already. But there's one more important thing that we often forget, because I read somewhere while, going through the earlier discussions, that gender is also about gender norms, which are often sanctioned in the name of culture, caste, custom, religion, faith, legislation even. So I was also interested in looking at, the way women have to dress up in these countries and how it is linked to their situation and condition in the wake of a disaster. Suppose it's flood or tsunami or it's earthquake, and I can explain if you want further. And then comes Pakistan. I have already said a little bit about it, and the flood. Now, 9 out of 10 disasters in the world, if I'm not wrong, they're related to water. Now, the recent floods, they are, I have no words to explain, but just to tell you the scale, 1 in 7 Pakistanis are affected by it, and we are more than 200 million people. And Pakistan is not responsible for the carbon emission. So you see, when we said that it's an emergency, there's also, we are talking about a lot of C's. I was just noticing, conflict and climate and crisis and conversation, but what about the crime? So we are talking about a crime, but we cannot, because we are poor in so many respects and we are weak. We cannot point out, we cannot identify the criminals. So, and how this has to be compensated. The usual way is, of course, international aid and relief, but who gets the aid? And as pointed out earlier by Honorable Ambassador, that there are also security issues. So I have also written about, and there are many more. By the way, just taking the lead from Dr. Oates, I'm not a climate specialist. Rather, I'm not an expert of anything. I am just a person from the field who has worked with communities. And being a non-elite, I have yet to work for communities. That's the constituency of philanthropists. So I know what exactly happens, with the actual people. So lot of things, they get mixed up. And in this whole scenario, though gender is given, some attention in all power platforms and all widely published and popular reports, when you go to the field and you look at the resource allocation, you find that, okay, it is not reaching to the people and to the women who actually need it. What women in Pakistan are doing, again, there is no one class, there is no one category, and no homogeneity between women. So women who need it, they are actually still in a very passive position. And an elite group, elite capture has already been identified by many IFIs and UN agencies. It is still there. So I don't devalue local movements and discourses, but it is not getting its due attention. And that, to me, as a person, as a practitioner who has always been most of the time in the field, it actually hurts me. So I see this as a problem.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I think on the question of climate change experts and expertise, I can imagine those that are the most impacted are the experts on the ways that climate change has really uprooted their lives and their resources and their livelihoods. I was touched speaking on the Pakistan floods and the aftermath and sort of just both the personal needs of those that are displaced, particularly the women that you highlighted, and that gender, from what I'm taking, the gender implications are both deeply, deeply personal, but also systemic and institutional. Thank you for that. If I could turn to Dr. Oates, could you speak a little bit more? You gave us such wonderful insights and nuggets to follow about the way that you center education and learning as foundational to any advocacy, whether it's climate change at the intersection of any other crises. Could you speak about the overlapping crises of gender and human rights and poverty and environmental degradation, specifically in Afghanistan as you've witnessed it? What are you hearing from Afghan women about what they need to support their advocacy in these areas?
Yeah, thanks for that question and for pointing out that intergenerational issue, which is so important and often overlooked. And one of the things we're seeing now in Afghanistan is, that the de facto authorities can take away many things from people, but education is something that they can't take away, and that gets passed on from generation to generation. So coming to these overlapping crises, I think it's common knowledge that Afghanistan is experiencing several concurrent crises. You have the human rights crisis triggered by the Taliban's takeover in August 2021, and the literally hundreds of restrictions. Women's rights activists are documenting these, and they've counted a couple hundred of them since they've taken power. And many of those restrictions are aimed at introducing or at eliminating women's rights and freedoms to such an extent that many Afghan women refer to the Taliban's goal as being to make women disappear from public life altogether. So that's one. And then you have the humanitarian crisis triggered by the collapse of the Afghan economy, and then the resulting hunger crisis, unemployment, and so on. You have a climate crisis with drought impacting the country's ability to produce food, and a severe winter this year that has actually led to hundreds of deaths so far. You have a political crisis in terms of the legitimacy of the current government. And finally, a refugee crisis, as hundreds of thousands of people have fled the country seeking safety elsewhere. So those facts are well known. What is perhaps not common knowledge is that all of these crises are in fact one and the same. They are so interlinked that it's not possible to understand any one of them without understanding their relationships to the others. It's not a correlational relationship. It is fundamentally a causal relationship. I so often see the humanitarian crisis, for example, discussed in isolation from the human rights crisis. But let's be clear, the country is plunging into severe poverty because of the Taliban's policies, notably its restrictions on women's work and education, because of its governance, and because it is arresting and killing dissidents, and because it's spreading fear among people who in turn are leaving in droves if they can. So the human rights crisis is the humanitarian crisis, and the refugee crisis is one of the consequences. And similarly, there's simply no discussion of climate change without discussion of rights. The connection between poverty and climate change is by now well established, but rights and equity have been less centered in the discussion. And I think that this connection is best explained by Afghan women themselves. I'm going to share just brief summaries and clips from stories and essays that come from a volume called Afghan Women at the Forefront of Climate Change. And you can find that text in its entirety online, and I encourage you to do so. It's really wonderful. My mom has this saying of, no stories without numbers, no numbers without stories. And I think you'll find that hearing the stories from those directly affected really puts a different lens on things. So I'll start with Yalda from Herat province in Western Afghanistan. She writes about the impact of dwindling water supplies in rural areas, leading to drought and eventually to a devastated local economy in areas where everyone depends on agriculture and raising livestock. So water is really important. As households earn less, women are less likely to have access to healthcare. So then their pregnancies are more dangerous, their infants are more at risk of not surviving, and their children more likely to be malnourished. Poverty and hunger puts girls at risk of early and forced marriage. Girls married as children are more likely to face domestic violence, and Yalda tells a story where this is exactly what happened, as well as a host of health risks from early pregnancy. Flooding and increased erratic weather and natural disasters further destabilize households already living on the margins. Next slide, please. Sarah is an Afghan woman calling for the world to consider the impact climate change has on her country, on the poor, and on women in particular. She writes, when a family does not have enough money to afford to pay for the education of all their children, they do not allow their girls to go to school so that they can provide the opportunity for their sons to go to school. In very unpleasant situations, girls are even sold by their fathers or brothers so that the rest of the family can have enough food and clothes. Therefore, Afghan women and girls are the most vulnerable human beings in the world, as climate change exacerbates poverty, and poverty increases the level of gender inequality in Afghanistan. Next slide, please. Mojgan's story is about losing her beloved daughter in a flood as she tried to get to Kabul from her rural province for her daughter to have surgery and be able to walk again. She wrote, all of them were trying to rescue themselves without paying attention to my daughter's disability. I still remember how I cried and begged for their help to carry my daughter, but no one helped me. I hugged my daughter and told her to tighten her hands around my neck. I was hardly moving until we were drawn in the flood, and then I did not feel my daughter's hand around my neck. We don't often hear these voices from those carrying the heaviest, most painful burden of climate change. But when we do, it becomes clear that climate change is not an abstract thing, and that it is fundamentally about rights. Next slide, please. As the climate journalist Lauren Wolfe asks, how exactly are girls supposed to improve outcomes or even learn how to contribute to the fight against the climate crisis if they are banned from politics and critically from education? So I'll leave it there and yeah, look forward to further discussion.
Thank you for that. And I think what's quite clear in the impacts of climate change, both in the example you gave, Rakshinda, and the example you gave, Dr. Oates, is the cost of human life. And without us in this, in our Canadian homes and Canadian cities, without putting a spotlight and names to those that are most impacted, we won't really understand the toll and the true cost of human life. So thank you for allowing us to hear those narratives and to be a part of this conversation with them. I want to the next question in our dialogue, I'd like to offer it to the both of you, because I think you've touched on it in your conversations previously, but particularly in your work around education, Dr. Oates, and in your work around gender education and the language that we use, Rakshinda, women are oftentimes only briefly acknowledged for their role in natural resource management, whether institutionally or otherwise. And, whether we're talking about traditional knowledge on land management or understanding what the drivers of climate change are. So as women are subsistence farmers in many countries are very familiar with the change in seasons. And when there are changes to farming land and the impact that has on their ability to be able to sustain livelihoods. So whether we're talking about the drivers of climate change or traditional knowledge on land management, how can we better take advantage of women's experience and expertise, since we're talking a lot about expertise, in resource management? And you both have very diverse contexts. So I know that, I'd love to hear more, and our audience would love to hear more as well. So if I could start with Rakshinda and Dr. Oates to follow.
Very briefly, include, women who are actually impacted by climate change. They are the missing women. And where are they located? They are located, they are on the margins of the society. So they are rural women. They are women with multiple disadvantages. And taking, clue from what Dr. Oates has just shown, a daughter's surgery. So we must not forget that how patriarchy spikes in the wake of a disaster in a humanitarian setting. The whole region, this is the patriarchal belt of South Asia, is characterized by sun preference. And we have seen it when there was tsunami, 2 countries from South Asia, Sri Lanka and Indian regions, they were impacted. And we have horrible tales of women who have to let go their daughters, not sons. I'm not drawing a comparison, and we are only talking about the binary division of gender, because when it comes to trans, it becomes so complex, so complicated, and of course they are the worst sufferers in the whole scenario. But even if we keep it binary, even then you see that who is the most at the most disadvantaged position. So those women, those girls, their communities, they need to be included as an active participant, not as the passive attendee. And this is what is happening, that we go to the field, we ask them questions. I mean, because I also wear a researcher hat and I have a guilt inside me. Of course, that's very important. But what next? After taking their valuable comments and their, writing down their stories and knowing that, okay, they have skills, we don't bring them to the, center of the discussion. They have yet to get a seat at the table. And I want those women to get a seat at the table. And they should be representing themselves. Maybe people like me and people who are more privileged than me, we may be acting as their translators. I don't know what, but just to be a little of little help to facilitate them. But they should be, taking the agenda to the table, and they should be representing themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, as barriers go, without addressing the barrier that gender-based violence is, and the cost of life for many young girls, then it's very difficult to talk about advocacy and activism in these contexts. Dr. Oates?
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, I think the role, you know, for those of us in places like Canada is to create the forums and provide access through the forums. I think that, you know, you'll find that Afghan women have a very good idea about both the consequences of climate change, the impact on them, and also what needs to be done. But to amplify their voices and give them forums to share what they have to say. And what I'm seeing, you know, I'm in the unusual position of having, I'm kind of watching, I'm in deja vu with Afghanistan. I sort of watched the Taliban take over and the impact that had in the 1990s and until their rule ended in 2001. And then watching it happen again 20 years later. And so it's very interesting to compare. And one of the huge differences from the time that Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban the first time and now is how organized women are, how sophisticated their activism is, and how much they're using technological tools at their disposal, which were not there, you know, 20 years ago. There was no internet in Afghanistan. There was not even phone lines. So that's made a huge difference, and they're fully taking advantage of that. And I think if you look, you'll definitely find you know, what they have to say about this out there online. And so, you know, I think that a very critical role for the international cooperation sector, and that includes governments, NGOs, individuals, is to enable access to these forums, to create these forums, and enable participation, and enable access to information of all kinds, because all kinds lead to empowerment, but inclusive of environmental and climate science education, and education relating to environmental stewardship. I think those can be very powerful roles for us to play.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, when you talk about deja vu with Afghanistan, and I'm noticing this with the dialogue on climate change as well and climate disasters globally, is that they've been here. We've been experiencing climate disasters at increasing frequency. And I think that's the biggest difference. But they certainly have been impacting many of these communities for decades in different ways. So I want to talk a little bit about, and you've raised it both, Dr. Oates and Rakshinda, about the forums in which these conversations happen and the inaccessibility of these forums. And in many ways, I think the climate change at the intersection of conflict and crisis, these 3 C's now, or 4 C's, is part of the public conversation and part of the dialogue on climate advocacy and climate change. And certainly we know that international and global feminist networks and advocacy has been central to that. But I want to ask both of you, from, you know, the work that you do and the communities that you engage in. We've heard a lot about this term that we need to give more consideration to when we talk about climate change and conflict and crisis, which is environmental peace building. And I know that, you know, in our policy circles, we love terms and phrases, but, you know, when you hear environmental peace building, what does that mean to you? And how can we better understand the role that women and girls can have in promoting climate action through this perspective? So can I start with Rakshinda?
Actually, when I was listening to you, I was thinking that is it okay if I say that we need at least 10 other panel discussions on just, you know, one dimension. So considering the time constraint, I would be very brief, but we cannot, continue this conversation without recalling some essential facts based on empirical evidence. And in a recent report by UN Women, I think, it was documented that with the current pace of actions around SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, it will take another 300 years to end inequality, and 140 years, and I'm just adding only because UN has its own language, and I'm using some activist expression here. So it will take 140 years to see women, a critical mass of women in leadership roles. So coming back to your question and trying to respond to it, when I was growing up and I was looking at mothers group for peace, in Middle East and the conflict areas, that how women as mothers can be a peacemaker. Well, peace has many definitions, and and we are in search of the definition of terrorism still. But environmental diplomacy is a growing branch of knowledge. And in countries like Pakistan, or if I can say South Asia, is bound to pay attention to this. And since I'm a Pakistani national, so I can see that in our case, we have a neighbor, India, so we have to focus on hydro diplomacy, and but again include the women with overlapping vulnerabilities in South Asian countries in climate diplomacy. This is very important. If we only go for those who meet a certain criteria, and what is that criteria? Ability to speak English with correct pronunciation and to appear in a certain way, to be able to write the financial proposal, it actually excludes these. So there must be a way out when we say that innovation and thinking out of the box. The idea is to enable those who have been disabled by the rules of business. So even today, we have to make, as Dr. Oates said, the human rights case as well as the business case for gender equality, for intersecting inequalities, and for giving a spotlight, if I borrow this word from this forum, to the climate change itself. Now, conveniently, we say, okay, climate change and gender inequality, these are cross-cutting themes, but do they really get the matching resources? I mean, this is the question that all powerful platforms should ask among themselves. So it's very important to me.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on what you said, Rakshinda, because we went from environmental diplomacy, environmental peace building, to environmental and/or climate diplomacy. And I think that's really pointing to action, right? And about how we can how the advocacy that needs to be done can be actioned in both local and global forums. Dr. Oates, I just want to turn really quickly to you. Whether it's environmental diplomacy, climate diplomacy, or environmental peace building, how do you see these? What do these terms mean to you in the context that you've been working in?
It's interesting. We refer to before, after, and during conflict, and I think in reality, often the lines between those categories are so blurry. It's hard to pinpoint, exactly when a conflict ends. When are we in the peace building phase or the post-conflict phase, so to speak? And so, just as we advocate for education to not be held back for post-conflict, that it's not this luxury thing that we can get to when things are peaceful again. It needs to actually be part of humanitarian responses to emergencies. needs to be considered part and parcel of that response in cases of war or natural disaster, because we know that interruptions to education are very, very dangerous. And the longer they go on, the less likely people are ever to resume education. So at the same time, I think talking about climate change has to be part and parcel of that as well, and can't be reserved for this thing we get to when things have calmed down and emergency needs are taken care of. And similarly, it needs to be integrated. And this event is an example of that. I'm sure many of those attending, and at least me as a presenter, we're not representing organizations that are specialized in climate change or even have any kind of significant programming in climate change, but simply asking where are the entry points where we can bring it in, even if it's in a modest way. And one very specific example of that, about 13 or 14 years ago, our office in Kabul, we decided to adopt a green policy. So our work was in education and nothing to do with climate and the environment per se, but we recognized that the way we do our programming still can have an impact on the environment. And just as we want to do no harm in how we do our programming, we also want to identify ways where maybe we can do some good on environmental issues. So we developed this green policy, and then we made it public and we shared it with other organizations to say, this is what we've started. Maybe others can pick it up, and so I think just starting somewhere. With whatever you can. There's a quote we say all the time within our organization that comes from Rumi: if all you can do is crawl, start crawling. So just start where you can, and even if it's modest. And I think working to integrate these things and not treat them as items in separate silos, and assume others are going to take care of that, and organizations that specialize in working on climate change and climate solutions.
Absolutely. And I think I have to thank you both, because what you've done, as is the theme of the conversation today in demystifying these linkages, is that you've made these issues accessible, and that we don't have to wait for so-called experts, whereas in fact those that are the most impacted and the most vulnerable should be seen as the leading experts on these issues, including its solutions. So we do have a question for our panelists. I'm going to read the question, and then Rakshinda, I know I do go back and forth between you both. I'd love it if you could go first, and then certainly Dr. Oates, please. So the question is, how can we reconcile Canada's climate-focused aims with Canadians being among the world's worst carbon emitters? I think this is something you pointed to, Rakshinda. Have the panelists seen this contradiction impact stakeholders' abilities to affect global change? And I think stakeholders here are the women in the communities that you're all working with. So Rakshinda, if I can offer.
I'm happy to see this candid question. And as Dr. Siham pointed out, that I have actually already mentioned this. So what I mentioned has also the answer within it. The weak and the not powerless, but at least with less power or less, they cannot even, identify, I mean, crime and criminal may sound strong words, and but I'm an activist as well, and so that gives me the license to use some strong words as well. But it's about personal accountability as well. It is about looking inward, because and that's why some of my work, as I said, that I'm expert of maybe nothing, but it's like a student of life, that in the last 5 years I'm particularly focusing from where I started when as a young entrepreneur I was awarded a Ashoka Fellowship, and then my work was around empathy, and I could not find an equivalent word in Pakistani languages, which are more than 100 other than the national language Urdu. So I'm trying to link I'm in my humble capacity with my different hats to link empathy with public policy. And of course, I got this courage through a Harvard research as well, where medical doctors from Harvard, they came up with this evidence that empathy can be taught. So maybe governments are in need to learn empathy.
Absolutely. Dr. Oates?
Yeah, this is something that came up a lot in that collection of essays and stories by Afghan women that I mentioned earlier, where they pointed out that the behavior of other countries, their governments, businesses, consumers, have impacts that cross borders and affect people in other living elsewhere. There's no borders in the skies or the oceans. And so I think they're demanding some acknowledgement of this and recognition of the impact. And I think it's important we see that impact in very human terms, that we don't get sort of bogged down in the policy language and the stats, but that we hear those stories to know this is a real thing impacting people now, not at some future time, but right now, and the consequences are very dire.
And I think, and what I hear, what I'm struck by in being in conversation with the both of you is just sort of the enormity of the problem, but the accessibility of the solution, right? And of course, first and foremost, to include the voices of those that are the most impacted and lead by example, right? And I think that's part of asking, as Canadians, we are part of the worst carbon emitters, and recognizing that and bringing that honesty to these dialogues is going to be critical. We do have another question, which I think is a fantastic one and leads us to a conversation on action and getting involved. So a participant asks, how best can we transition into working in these spaces with alternative educations and or skills? If Samira has earned a degree in psychology, but finds most roles in these spaces require management or policy experience. Rakshinda, you told us about all the many hats that you wear, but all the advocacy that you've done and the diversity of work and the spaces that you've, taken up. Can I ask you to respond to this? And then Dr. Oates, please.
Okay, thank you. My non-academic response, a bit emotional, and I would shamelessly share it. I still face this challenge, and I come from a very pretentious society. So it's not about me, myself, session, but I'm telling you that there are many like me. And it took me like 30 years. This is my 30th year in the industry. I don't know, Samira, how old are you? But yes, if you're non-elite, if you don't have means, if you're living and trying to survive and thrive in a society where merit is least important, you have a lot of difficulties, okay? And it's not okay. So, but you have to keep trying and creating your own pathway. It sounds very much like Rumi's saying, but this is what I had been doing. And when I got this invitation, I have to admit it, I said, okay. And, but where it took me many years of work to be able to join such forums. And even today, I'm asked this question, sometimes with sarcasm, sometimes with genuine respect. Oh, you're a medical doctor. Okay. So what does it mean? So you don't get paid equivalent to someone who has done, masters in business administration or policy management. So you see, we talk about including women from communities. We talk about amplifying their voices. But once you see one such woman, you either try to sideline it, or so it requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of courage, and we all know that we live in an unfair world, but But the world has changed. Technology itself is a game changer, even if nobody has become, I mean, those who are in power, even if they're not too empathetic or too honest, the technology is a game changer. And that's why, if I always say that if I have to introduce myself with one title, it will be always a social entrepreneur, because that gives you that space. So don't lose heart. And I mean, it's where there are a lot of opportunities. If you're not finding any, create one, and you will be somewhere. But you should know what is your purpose. Purpose is most important. If you're clear about the purpose, like I once I discovered it before reading the feminist theories, that actually this is what I am, and I have to work to end, or at least to highlight gender inequalities. I did not bother that how many degrees I have, or I don't have, or I couldn't get, and how much I received from life as a motherhood penalty. So this is life. This is life.
I like that. Be brave. Dr. Oates?
Yeah, I like this question and Dr. Parveen's answer, and I can certainly build on that, just drawing from my own experience. I got really motivated to respond to the situation in Afghanistan the first time around in the 1990s when I was still a high school student. And, the education I was getting at my public high school was fairly irrelevant to, how do you act in solidarity, how to be an activist, how to make change in the world meaningfully. And I found that the best education I got in that regard was the education I was giving myself through my own research, through joining human rights organizations, connecting with other youth who were active in human rights and gender equality outside school. I think it's maybe a bit different now that there's maybe perhaps more opportunities within the curriculum and within schools to engage in some of those issues, but never underestimate the education that you can give yourself. Of course, it's always important what letters come behind your name, what degrees you have on paper. And it's a question that I see a lot from students in the School of Humanitarian Studies, where they did an undergrad in musicology, or they were a realtor or a nurse, and now they want to work internationally, and they're worried that the undergraduate education I got isn't relevant to what I want to do now. And I think, it's sort of part of the windy pathway you take. And I think for very few people, you kind of know exactly what you're going to do. The moment you graduate high school and you embark on your education, you end up changing your minds a lot of times. And you also end up sort of seeing what's needed. And that's been my experience. When I did my undergrad, there was no program on education in conflict zones. I think there was one single program on human rights in Canada. There's probably more now, but so I enrolled in a bachelor degree in international development. I started there, and off I go to Afghanistan, and I'm enthusiastically talking about human rights, and then women there are telling me, yeah, we know about all that rights stuff. We don't need you to tell us. But most of the women in our country are illiterate. So what are we supposed to do about realizing our rights when most of us can't read or write? And I recognized, the education was entwined with rights, and that was the critical need. And so I went back to school and did a degree in education. And so, you have to connect those dots and sort of learn what's needed as you're going, and then make your own combinations of expertise based on what is actually needed, because our higher education system is always a little behind what is actually going on, and what kind of education is needed to make a difference in the world. It's very rigid. We have these disciplines and degree programs that in some cases go back hundreds of years. They were concocted by what the needs were for study at a much different time, and they're always evolving, but they're always a little bit behind. So I think you want to creatively combine disciplines for what's needed for what you want to work on, and sort of look at opportunities where you can take perhaps your background in psychology can be combined with other things. And then you have a really niche area of expertise to offer. And then complementing formal education with other forms of education, and never thinking narrowly about what is education, and don't underestimate, what learning you can conquer yourself outside of school.
Thank you for that. And I would add, probably participating in OCIC International Development Week events can bridge some of that gap between what we don't know, what we'd like to learn, and the conversations that we can all have together. So, I mean, you've taken us both, Dr. Rakshinda Parveen and Dr. Lauren Oates, you've taken us on quite a journey in this conversation, talking very specifically about the context of Afghan women and the importance of education and literacy programs, and talking about the importance of, working at both a grassroots and at an institutional level, and changing gender norms and highlighting the impact and the intersections of multiple forms of inequality. And we're adding climate change to those multiple forms of intersecting inequalities. This has been the best education for me. I have to say, I feel really privileged to have been with you all this early afternoon, and to have heard from all of you. And I know that our hosts, OCIC, will be offering because I know there was a question about how to get involved. So I know that Pragya will certainly be offering some of that, but I want to thank you, Dr. Lauren Oates. I want to thank you, Dr. Rakshinda Parveen. And I do hope that this isn't the last time that we have a conversation here together. And I do look forward now to following both of your work and learning more from you. So I'll end my hosting duties there and transition it over to Pragya.
Thank you so much, Siham, Lauren, and Rakshinda, for your insight and expertise. It's been such an honor and pleasure to learn from you. I will, and I'm sure you will too, will all reflect on today's discussion. I would now like to invite everyone to please complete the short Zoom poll that we will soon be launching on your screen. While you complete the poll, we are posting in the chat the link to OCIC's final IDW 2023 event. It is an in-person innovation lab, which will be held this Saturday, 11th of February, at the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto. The event will provide an opportunity for participants to learn more about the use of film, photography, muralism, and podcasting as tools to engage others in climate action, gender equality, and other cross-cutting sustainable development issues. We hope that you'll consider joining us. Once again, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the ambassador for her remarks, and to Siham, Lauren, and Rakshinda for sharing their wisdom with all of us in this panel. I'd also like to thank Arabelle, Sarah, Elizabeth, Lisa, and Kim from the OCIC team for all their efforts, and Global Affairs Canada, and our colleagues in the Engaging Canadians branch for their financial and logistical support for all of this and all of OCIC's International Development Week initiatives. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day ahead.